John chapter 18 describes the arrest, trial, and the beginning of Jesus' suffering as he is taken from the Garden of Gethsemane to the high priests, and eventually to the Roman governor Pilate. This chapter marks the beginning of the Passion narrative, which culminates in Jesus' crucifixion. In verses 1 through 11, Jesus and his disciples go to the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. Judas, who had already agreed to betray Jesus to the religious leaders, leads a detachment of soldiers and temple officials to the garden. Jesus, knowing everything that would happen, steps forward and asks, "Who is it you want?" When they reply, "Jesus of Nazareth," Jesus says, "I am he." At these words, the crowd falls backward, which demonstrates his authority and power. Jesus allows himself to be arrested, asking the soldiers to let his disciples go, so that the prophecy would be fulfilled, that none of them would be lost. Peter, in an act of defense, draws a sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant Malchus, but Jesus rebukes him, telling him to put the sword away. Jesus knows that he must drink the cup of suffering that the Father has given him, and that he must fulfill God's will. In verses 12 through 24, Jesus is arrested and first taken to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest. Caiaphas had previously advised the Jewish leaders that it was better for one man to die for the people rather than the whole nation perish. While this interrogation is happening, Peter denies Jesus 3 times as predicted. In the courtyard, a servant girl accuses Peter of being with Jesus, but he denies it. The chief priests and the whole Jewish council question Jesus about his teachings. Jesus responds that everything he taught was in the open in synagogues and the temple. Annas sends Jesus bound to Caiaphas, the high priest, for further questioning, but their interrogation is unjust. They are looking for false testimony to condemn Jesus to death, but their efforts fail. In verses 25 through 27, we have the continued denial of Peter. Peter follows Jesus at a distance, and when he is recognized by a servant girl and others, he denies knowing Jesus 3 times. The rooster crowing serves as a painful reminder of Jesus' words to Peter earlier, where he foretold Peter's denial before the rooster crowed. Peter's sorrow and repentance after the denial are implied, though John does not go into detail about Peter's emotional state. However, other Gospels show that after the crowing of the rooster, Peter went out and wept bitterly, feeling the weight of his failure. In verse 28 through 40, Jesus is brought before Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate is not interested in Jewish religious matters, but he is pressed by the Jewish leaders who want Jesus executed. Pilate questions Jesus, asking if he is the king of the Jews. Jesus responds that his kingdom is not of this world, meaning that he is not a political threat to the Roman Empire. Jesus affirms that he was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. Pilate, still unsure of what to do with Jesus, asks the crowd if they want him to release Jesus, but they demand the release of Barabbas, a notorious criminal, instead of Jesus. Pilate is caught between wanting to release Jesus and the pressure from the crowd. Pilate attempts to absolve himself by offering to have Jesus flogged, scourged, in hopes of satisfying the crowd. This brutal punishment only increases the crowd's demand for Jesus' crucifixion. Pilate famously asks, "What is truth?" but finds no guilt in Jesus. However, he ultimately gives in to the demands of the people, condemning Jesus to be crucified. There are 5 key themes in John chapter 18:1. Jesus' obedience to the Father's will. Throughout his arrest and trial, Jesus demonstrates his absolute obedience to God's plan. He knows the suffering he will endure is part of the Father's will, and he submits to it willingly. This is most evident when he tells Peter to put away his sword, as Jesus must drink the cup of suffering. 2. Fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion fulfill many Old Testament prophecies, including those about his suffering, his rejection by his own people, and his sacrificial death. The chapter also highlights Jesus' earlier prophecy about Peter's denial. 3. The innocence of Jesus. Throughout the trial, Jesus is innocent, and Pilate recognizes that there is no legal basis for his execution. However, Jesus is condemned to death, not because of his guilt, but because of the pressure from the crowd and the religious leaders. This illustrates the unjust nature of his suffering. 4. Peter's denial. Peter's denial is a tragic moment that underscores human weakness and failure. Despite his earlier boldness, Peter is unable to stand firm when faced with pressure and fear. His story also highlights God's grace and mercy, as he later repents and is restored by Jesus after his resurrection, as seen in the later chapters of John. 5. The political and religious tension. There is a tension throughout the trial between political authority, Pilate, and religious authority, the Jewish leaders. Pilate tries to avoid the responsibility of condemning Jesus, but ultimately gives in to the pressure of the crowd. This tension reveals the broader conflict between Jesus' divine mission and the earthly systems of power that reject him. John chapter 18 is pivotal in the Passion narrative because it sets the stage for the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus. Despite the injustice and betrayal that Jesus faces, he remains committed to the Father's will. His submission to the trial and arrest exemplifies his complete obedience, which leads to the ultimate sacrifice for humanity's sins. For Peter, this chapter also highlights the tension between bold faith and fear. His denial of Jesus shows the fragility of human strength and reminds us of the need for God's grace in times of failure. At the same time, Pilate's indecision and the religious leaders' rejection of Jesus remind us of the larger story of God's sovereignty over the world. Even though Jesus is condemned unjustly, this is the very moment when God's plan for salvation is being fulfilled. Jesus calls us to look to his example of obedience and grace, especially when facing challenges in our own lives. This chapter challenges us to reflect on our own faithfulness to Christ and God's plan for us. Are we faithful when things are not going the way we planned or would like? Are we faithful when we are personally impacted by the many people who reject Christianity or Christians outright? Are we faithful when social pressure tries to push us into denying Jesus or his truth?